Welcome to the Department of Prints and Drawings here at the British Museum. My name's Catherine Daunt and I'm the Curator of Modern and Contemporary Prints here at the British Museum. And I'm also the Curator of Picasso Printmaker, an exhibition looking at Picasso's art and career through his prints from the early days in Paris when he was a young man, right until his final years when he was living in the south of France in the early 1970s. The exhibition will include around 100 works from the British Museum's collection. We have around 550 prints by Picasso, which means we have the largest and most representative collection of Picasso's prints in the UK. Picasso made his very first print in 1904, the year he moved to Paris from Barcelona as a 22-year-old. He had very little money at the time. He had trained as a painter in Spain and lived for a number of years in Barcelona and had no printmaking experience. He tried his hand at etching when he moved to Paris, partly because Paris was a hub for printmaking at the time. There were lots of professional printers and studios that he could call on for help. And also he had lots of artists around him who were able to help him to learn the basics of printmaking. So he made his first print in that year, 1904. And our first print in the exhibition is that print. It's known as the Frugal Meal. It's an image of an impoverished couple sitting in a drinking tavern. They have an empty plate before them, a small bread roll, an empty glass, and alongside a large bottle. It was made during the time that Picasso was making lots of paintings that were dominated by a blue and a green palette, known as his blue period, and his subject was often melancholy in tone. This print is typical of Picasso's work at the time, when he was interested in people living on the margins of society, people that he would see around him in Paris on the streets. Alcoholics, sex workers, itinerant street performers. He was impoverished himself at the time, and perhaps he identified with these people who were living a very precarious hand-to-mouth life. The couple in this print appear undernourished. They've got very bony limbs. The man seems to be blind. The plate before them is empty, but they've got this large looming bottle at the side suggesting alcoholism. It's an incredible first print. Picasso had made one print before when he was 17 in 1899, but had put aside printmaking, being unhappy with the result, and so only really took up etching when he moved to Paris. He recycled a zinc plate that had been used by a friend of his, another artist from Spain, and he burnished out the image, scraped away the image, and turned it on its side to create this portrait of this couple in a drinking tavern. His inexperience is evident here at the top right, where we can see tufts of grass, a remnant of the previous landscape image by the other artist. Picasso tended to work on his prints episodically, and this is from a group of prints that he made between 1904 and 1906, his first real foray into printmaking. And the exhibition takes us through those main episodes of his printmaking career, beginning with these early works in Paris. He made very few prints during the First World War, when it was difficult for him to access materials and when his print publishers had to cease trading. He then re-engaged with printmaking in the 1920s, and the 1930s was a really important period for him. The next print we're going to look at is from this period, when he produced a suite called the Vollard Suite, a series of 100 etchings that he made between 1930 and 1937. In 1917, Picasso visited Italy, where he saw art from ancient Greece and Rome. This sparked a change in his style. He moved on from his Cubist period of the 1910s and into a more naturalistic style. He was also very interested in classical subjects, in Greek mythology, and one of the characters that he was particularly drawn to was the character of the Minotaur, the mythical half-man, half-bull, that was kept in a labyrinth in Crete by King Minos and fed young men and women. Picasso seems to have identified with the Minotaur and became a symbol of the primal urges of humans, particularly for the surrealists with whom Picasso was associated in the 1920s. The Minotaur appears repeatedly in the Vollard Suite. At times, he's depicted as brutal and violent, at other times vulnerable, sometimes tender. In this print, which is one of the later prints from the Vollard Suite, the Minotaur is depicted as blind. He's walking with a stick and being led by a little girl who resembles Marie-Thérèse Walter, Picasso's lover at the time. Marie-Thérèse holds a dove, a bird that Picasso depicted many times throughout his career. Picasso became particularly interested in printmaking techniques at this time and became quite experimental. This print is quite different to lots of the others in the Vollard Suite. Picasso is really playing with textures, and he's really trying to achieve this dark black to present this night sky. You can see how he's burnished the plate to create these lighter areas. He's really become accomplished as a printmaker by this point, and he's innovating and experimenting to create new and interesting images. Picasso completed the Vollard Suite in 1937. During the Second World War, again, he put printmaking aside, but remained in Paris, making paintings and sculptures. He then took up printmaking again following the Second World War, when he was able to access print studios and he was looking for a new creative challenge. He found that creative challenge in lithography, a technique he'd not really experimented with until this point. He began to make lithographs intensively in 1945 and continued to make them throughout his career. The next print that we'll look at is from that period. Picasso made this print in 1948. It's a portrait of his partner at the time, Françoise Gillot, with whom he moved to the south of France in that year. He'd been experimenting with lithography since 1945. This technique is very different from etching in that the artist is required to draw an image on the surface of a stone or a zinc plate rather than etch into a metal plate. It allowed him to create textures that were very different from those of his etchings and his aquatints and dry points. Picasso oscillated between different styles throughout most of his career. At times, his images were quite realistic looking, and other times much more abstracted. Clearly, this portrait of Françoise is quite an abstract image. We can clearly see the face, the deep, penetrating eyes looking at us, the nose, the mouth. But the rest of the image is open to interpretation. We're not sure if these are limbs. Perhaps these curly squiggles are Françoise's long hair. Picasso made many portraits of his wives and his lovers throughout his career, all very different at different times. Picasso continued to make lithographs, but he also tried different techniques. In the 1950s, shortly after making this lithograph, he discovered Linocut printmaking, a technique that he focused on, particularly between 1959 and 1962. Picasso discovered Linocut printmaking while he was living in the south of France. He'd been making ceramics at this time, and his first Linocuts were posters to advertise the annual ceramics exhibition in the town in which he lived. But then he discovered the possibilities of the medium and began to experiment more intensively. This is one of his greatest Linocut prints. It's called Still Life Under the Lamp. Still lives were a common subject in his art right from his early years in Paris. He used a technique called reductive linocut printmaking, whereby he printed the linocut from one single block of linoleum rather than lots of different blocks, one for each color as was traditional. He began by cutting the section that was to be printed in yellow, and then all the pieces of paper for the edition were printed with the yellow section. He then cut the block further to create the images that were to be printed in red, then the green, and then the black. He had to hold in his head what he wanted the final image to be so that he knew what to cut at each stage. And apparently, he never made drawings or plans for these prints. He just knew in his mind what he wanted the final image to be. His linocuts are among his largest and his most colourful prints. He made this print when he was 80. He clearly still really enjoyed printmaking, really enjoyed a new creative challenge, really enjoyed experimenting and innovating and learning new techniques. We're very fortunate in the British Museum collection to have the different stages of this image, the yellow, the red, the green, and the black. And we'll show them alongside this final print in the exhibition so that you can see the development of the image and the way that Picasso continually cut as the print was coming together. Picasso continued to make prints right into his final years, making his last in 1972. In 1968, when he was 86, he made a series called the 347 Suite, 347 etchings, aquatints, and dry points that he made in just under 7 months. This is one of the prints from the 347 Suite. At the time, Picasso rarely left his home in the south of France. and his health was beginning to fail. In 1966, his 85th birthday had been widely celebrated in France. He was hailed as a hero, but he was also slightly out of step with contemporary art. He didn't like new art movements, he didn't like pop art or abstract expressionism. He spent most of his time in 1968 working on prints or drawings at his kitchen table. He was lucky that he had some printers, Aldo and Piero Crommelink, who'd set up a studio close by, so he could work on the plates at home, and they would come and collect them and do the printing for him at their studio. He worked incredibly intensively on these prints, sometimes producing 7 or 8 prints a day. The 347 suite is like a visual diary. It's an outpouring of his interests, sometimes reflecting things he'd seen on TV or in the movies, but he was also reflecting on his life. He was representing subjects that had interested him throughout his career. He was thinking about his legacy. In this print, we can see some of the ways in which he experimented with the actual technique of printmaking. It's an etching and aquatint, but he smeared grease onto the printing plate to create these unusual textures in this tree in the foreground. Alongside, you can see these figures, a naked woman, a man in a musketeer-type costume, and somebody on a horseback fleeing towards a church in the background. In the 347 suite, as well as reflecting on his own life, Picasso liked to tell stories. He called it his way of writing fiction. He brought in characters from literature, from art, from things he'd seen on TV. He spent his days entertaining himself by creating these tales, and here we get a glimpse of one of the stories he's trying to tell. Picasso made many of these prints very quickly. He was working impulsively and intuitively, almost subconsciously, drawing and sketching the first thing that came to mind. The British Museum is fortunate to hold the whole of the 347 suite, although we'll just be showing a selection of 28 prints in the exhibition to give a representation of the kinds of things that he was interested in at this time. Through this exhibition, we hope that you'll see something of his printmaking, the techniques he was interested in, his skill as a printmaker, the contribution that he made to the medium, but also you'll get a sense of the man himself, the way in which his style changed over the years, and the subjects that fascinated him. We hope that you can come and see this exhibition, which is open now and on until the 30th of March.